So far, throughout this presentation, we have explored Plato's ideas about reality, knowledge, education, justice, and politics. Now we arrive at one of the most important topics not only in philosophy but also in English literature. This slide introduces what scholars call the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Why is this topic so important? Because almost every theory of literature that came after Plato was influenced by this debate. In fact, Aristotle's famous book Poetics was largely written as a response to Plato's criticism of poetry. So, if you understand this slide clearly, you will understand the beginning of Western literary criticism. Why did Plato criticize poetry? At first, Plato's criticism seems strange. After all, Plato himself was an excellent writer. His books contain beautiful stories, powerful myths, dramatic conversations, and memorable characters. So why would someone who writes so beautifully criticize poets? The answer is simple. Plato believed that the purpose of philosophy is to discover truth, while the purpose of poetry is often to create emotional pleasure. Whenever emotion and truth conflict, Plato chooses truth. For him, truth is always more important than entertainment. To understand his criticism, we must remember everything we have already studied. Remember the world of forms. Remember the realm of being and the realm of becoming. Remember the divided line. Everything now comes together. Plato's three levels of reality. Look carefully at the staircase on the slide. It shows three different levels. These three steps explain Plato's criticism of art. Let us climb them one by one. Step 1. The form of the table. The highest step is called the form of the table. According to Plato, before any carpenter builds a table, there already exists a perfect, eternal, unchanging, ideal table in the world of forms. This perfect table is not made of wood. It never breaks. It never becomes old. It never changes. It represents the very essence of tableness. Think about mathematics. The idea of a perfect circle exists. But if you draw a circle on paper, it will never be perfectly round. Similarly, the perfect form exists only in the intelligible world. Everything else is only an imperfect copy. This form is therefore the highest reality. Step 2. The physical wooden table. Now we come to the second step. A carpenter builds an actual wooden table. This is the table we use every day. We eat on it. We write on it. We place our books on it. Unlike the perfect form, this table can be scratched. It can burn. It can break. It will eventually decay. Therefore, according to Plato, the carpenter's table is only an imitation of the eternal form. It is real, but not perfectly real. It belongs to the realm of becoming, the world that constantly changes. Step 3. The painted or poetic table. Now we arrive at the third step. Suppose an artist paints the table, or a poet writes a beautiful poem describing the table. Can we use that painted table? Can we sit at it? Can we place our books on it? Of course not. It is only an image. The artist is not copying the perfect form. The artist is copying the carpenter's table. Since the carpenter's table is already a copy, the painting becomes a copy of a copy. This is why Plato says that the artist is thrice removed from reality. Let us count. First comes the perfect form. Second comes the physical object. Third comes the artistic imitation. Each step moves farther away from ultimate truth. Understanding mimesis. Now look at the box on the right. It introduces the Greek word mimesis. Mimesis simply means imitation. According to Plato, all art is imitation. A painter imitates nature. A sculptor imitates the human body. A dramatist imitates human actions. A poet imitates human emotions. The problem is not imitation itself. The problem is that artists imitate appearances, not reality. They show how things look, not what they truly are. An everyday example. Imagine you are hungry. Someone shows you a beautiful photograph of a delicious meal. The photograph looks wonderful. You may even feel hungry. But can the photograph satisfy your hunger? No. Now imagine an actual plate of food. That can satisfy your hunger. The photograph only creates an appearance. Similarly, Plato says poetry often creates emotional appearances without giving genuine knowledge. Why Plato distrusted poets. Plato also believed that poets often speak confidently about subjects they do not actually understand. A poet may describe war, but has never fought in battle. He may describe medicine, but has never treated a patient. He may describe kingship, but has never governed a country. Yet readers admire him as though he were an expert. Plato believed this was dangerous. Knowledge should come from those who truly know, not merely from those who imitate knowledge through beautiful language. Poetry appeals to emotion. Another reason Plato criticized poetry is because it appeals to emotions. Think about watching a tragic movie. You cry, you feel fear, you become emotionally attached to fictional characters. Plato asks, does this make us wiser? His answer is often, no. Instead, he believed poetry strengthens the emotional part of the soul rather than the rational part. Remember the tripartite soul. Reason should rule, spirit should support reason, appetite should obey. But emotional poetry can weaken reason and strengthen uncontrolled feelings. Therefore, Plato worried that poetry could disturb the harmony of the soul. Why Plato wanted to regulate poetry? Because of this, Plato believed literature should be carefully regulated in the ideal state. He did not want poetry to encourage violence, immorality, false religion, or uncontrolled emotions. Instead, poetry should teach courage, justice, wisdom, and self-control. Only morally beneficial literature deserved a place in his ideal society. This is why Plato proposes excluding certain poets from his ideal republic. Aristotle's response. Interestingly, Plato's student, Aristotle, strongly disagreed with him. Aristotle accepted that poetry is imitation, but he argued that imitation is natural and beneficial. He believed poetry teaches universal truths. It helps us understand human nature. Most importantly, he argued that tragedy purifies emotions through catharsis rather than corrupting them. Therefore, Plato and Aristotle represent the first great debate in literary criticism. Every student of English literature should understand both sides of this argument. This slide explains Plato's famous criticism of poetry through his theory of mimesis, or imitation. According to Plato, reality exists in three levels: the eternal form, the physical object created by the craftsman, and the artistic representation created by the poet or painter. Because art imitates an already imperfect physical object rather than the perfect form itself, Plato argues that it is thrice removed from reality. He believed poets often imitate appearances instead of truth and appeal to emotions rather than reason, making them unreliable guides to knowledge. Therefore, Plato insisted that literature should promote truth, virtue, and moral education instead of illusion and emotional excess. This criticism became the foundation of Western literary criticism and later inspired Aristotle to defend poetry in Poetics, making this debate one of the most influential discussions in the history of literature. In the previous slide, we learned that Plato criticized literature because it is an imitation of reality. Today, Plato gives another reason for criticizing literature. This reason is even more important. He says literature is not only a problem because it imitates reality. It is also dangerous because it changes the human mind. According to Plato, good government begins with good citizens. Good citizens develop from good character. Good character develops when reason controls emotion and desire. If literature weakens reason, then it also weakens society. That is the central idea of this slide. The human soul according to Plato. First, look at the picture on the left. Notice the human head. Inside it there is a strong white pillar labeled reason. Around it are many red branches labeled emotion or appetite. This picture represents Plato's understanding of the human soul. Remember our earlier discussion about the tripartite soul. Every human being has three parts. The first is reason. The second is spirit. The third is appetite or desire. According to Plato, reason should always be the leader. It should guide the other two parts. Think of a car. Reason is the driver. Spirit is the engine that gives energy. Appetite is the fuel. If the driver controls the car, the journey is safe. But if the fuel somehow controls the driver, the journey becomes dangerous. Similarly, if emotions control reason, our decisions become poor. Plato believed literature often causes exactly this problem, nurturing the base desires. Now let us move to the first point. It is called nurturing the base desires. The word base means lower or inferior. According to Plato, every human being experiences emotions like anger, fear, grief, jealousy, lust, revenge, and excessive laughter. These emotions naturally exist within us. However, Plato believed that reason should keep these emotions under control. Now imagine watching a tragic movie. A sad scene appears. The audience begins to cry. Or imagine watching an action film. People become excited, angry, or eager for revenge. Or imagine a comedy. Everyone laughs uncontrollably. Plato asks, what is happening inside the mind? He answers, literature is feeding these emotions. Instead of strengthening reason, poetry strengthens the emotional part of the soul. He even says poetry feeds and waters the passions. Think about watering a plant. The more water you give, the stronger it grows. Similarly, the more we repeatedly enjoy uncontrolled emotions, the stronger those emotions become. This is why Plato believed literature could slowly weaken self-control. The Homeric problem. Now let us examine the second point. It is called the Homeric problem. To understand this, we must remember who Homer was. Homer was the greatest poet of ancient Greece. He wrote two famous epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Most Greek children learned values from Homer's poetry, but Plato strongly criticized parts of these poems. Why? Because Homer often presents the gods behaving badly. Sometimes the gods deceive people. Sometimes they quarrel. Sometimes they become jealous. Sometimes they fight among themselves. Plato believed this sent the wrong message. If even the gods behave immorally, people may think immoral behavior is acceptable. He also criticized heroes like Achilles. Achilles is brave, but he is also extremely angry. He loses control of his emotions. He seeks revenge. He mourns violently. According to Plato, young people who admire such heroes may imitate their emotional behavior. Therefore, Plato wanted these stories either removed or rewritten for educational purposes. He believed literature should present good moral examples, not emotionally uncontrolled heroes. Aesthetic distance failure. Now let us move to the third point. This section is called aesthetic distance failure. This sounds difficult, but the idea is actually simple. Normally, we know that a play, movie, or novel is fictional. We understand, this is only a story. That mental separation between reality and fiction is called aesthetic distance. But Plato says that while watching a performance, people often forget this distance. They become emotionally involved. They begin cheering for revenge. They enjoy scenes of violence. They admire dishonest characters. They cry for fictional tragedies. Imagine watching a crime movie. You know the criminal is fictional. Yet during the film, you may begin admiring his cleverness. For a short time, your emotions overcome your judgment. Plato believed this emotional involvement was dangerous. He feared that repeated exposure to such stories could slowly shape people's character. According to him, the theater becomes a place where people enjoy emotions that they would normally suppress in everyday life. Literature and moral education. Now let us connect everything together. For Plato, education is not simply about gaining information. Education is about forming character. If literature strengthens reason, it is useful. If literature weakens reason, it becomes harmful. That is why Plato insisted that literature should teach justice, courage, self-control, wisdom, and moral discipline. Stories should help people become better citizens. They should not simply entertain. Modern perspective. Today, many scholars disagree with Plato. Modern psychology often argues that literature can actually help us understand emotions rather than simply encouraging them. Reading novels can increase empathy. Watching tragedies can help people process grief. Stories can teach compassion, kindness, and emotional intelligence. This is one reason why Aristotle later defended literature. He argued that tragedy produces catharsis, a healthy purification or cleansing of emotions, instead of corrupting the mind. So, Plato and Aristotle offer two completely different ways of understanding literature. Plato says literature may weaken reason. Aristotle says literature can educate emotions. This debate continues even today. This slide explains Plato's psychological criticism of literature. According to Plato, the ideal human soul is governed by reason, while emotions and desires remain under rational control. He believed poetry and drama often strengthen the emotional part of the soul by encouraging pity, grief, anger, laughter, and other passions that should be carefully regulated. Plato also criticized Homer's epics for portraying gods and heroes behaving immorally, fearing that audiences, especially young people, would imitate these examples. Finally, he argued that during dramatic performances people lose their aesthetic distance, becoming emotionally absorbed and enjoying behaviors they would reject in real life. Therefore, Plato concluded that literature can disturb the harmony of the soul and weaken moral character unless it is carefully guided by truth, reason, and virtue. In the previous slides, we learned that Plato criticizes poetry because it is only an imitation of reality and because it appeals to our emotions rather than our reason. At this point, we may think that Plato completely rejects poetry, imagination, and inspiration. But that is not entirely true. This slide introduces one of the most interesting ideas in Plato's philosophy. Plato actually presents two very different kinds of inspiration. One kind is dangerous. The other kind is noble and uplifting. That is why this slide is called the duality of inspiration. The word duality simply means two opposite sides of the same idea. Let us understand each side one by one. The first side, the irrational channel, ion. Let us first look at the left side of the slide. This idea comes from Plato's dialogue called Ion. Ion was a famous performer who recited the poems of Homer before large audiences. Socrates asks Ion a very important question. How are you able to perform poetry so beautifully? Ion proudly believes that it is because of his knowledge and skill. But Socrates disagrees. He says, "You are not speaking because you understand the poem. You are speaking because you are inspired." According to Plato, the poet does not create by logical thinking. Instead, the poet is carried away by a mysterious divine force. Look at the first point. The poet is a feather-brained vessel. This sounds insulting, but Plato is making a philosophical point. A vessel is simply a container. The poet is only a container through which inspiration passes. The ideas do not come from careful reasoning. They come from divine possession. Plato compares this to a magnet. Imagine a magnet attracting several iron rings. The first ring attracts the second. The second attracts the third. Eventually all the rings move together. Similarly, the muse inspires the poet. The poet inspires the performer. The performer inspires the audience. Emotion passes from one person to another like an electric current. Notice something important. None of these people necessarily understands the truth. They are simply passing emotion along. That is why Plato says the rhapsode performs without rational knowledge. For example, imagine an actor giving a heartbreaking performance. The audience cries. Everyone feels emotional. But ask the actor, are you truly experiencing this situation? The answer is no. He is performing. He may not even personally believe what he is saying. Yet the audience is deeply moved. According to Plato, this emotional influence is powerful, but it is not genuine knowledge. That is why he calls this the irrational channel. Why Plato distrusts this kind of inspiration. Now we can understand Plato's concern. When people are guided only by emotion, they stop asking questions. They stop using reason. Instead, they simply follow whatever strongly moves their feelings. Think about modern life. A motivational speech, a dramatic movie, or an emotional social media video can make thousands of people react immediately. Sometimes the information is true. Sometimes it is completely false. But people react because of emotion, not because they carefully examined the facts. This is exactly what Plato fears. He believes reason should guide emotion, not the other way around. The second side, the erotic ascent, symposium. Now let us move to the right side of the slide. This idea comes from another dialogue called Symposium. At first, it seems surprising. Here Plato suddenly speaks positively about passion. How is that possible? The answer is that Plato distinguishes between uncontrolled desire and properly guided desire. The Greek word used here is eros. Today, people usually associate eros only with romantic love, but Plato gives it a much deeper meaning. For him, eros is the powerful desire that pushes human beings towards something higher. It is the longing for beauty, truth, wisdom, and perfection. In other words, love becomes the energy that moves the soul upward. Love as the beginning of philosophy. Imagine a young student who becomes fascinated by the beauty of mathematics. At first, he simply enjoys solving problems. Gradually, he begins to admire patterns, logic, and order. Eventually, he develops a love for truth itself. His original attraction has now become intellectual wisdom. This is exactly Plato's idea. The journey begins with physical attraction, but it should not end there. Instead, it should rise higher and higher. The ladder of love. In the Symposium, Plato describes what scholars call the ladder of love. A person first admires the beauty of one individual. Then, he realizes that beauty exists in many people. Next, he appreciates beautiful minds instead of merely beautiful bodies. After that, he begins to admire beautiful laws, beautiful institutions, beautiful knowledge, and finally, beauty itself. Not physical beauty, not temporary beauty, but the eternal form of beauty. This is why the arrow on the right side of the slide points upward. Love is not pulling the soul downward. It is lifting the soul upward toward truth. Properly directed passion. Look at the final point. Plato says physical desire can be refined. The word refined means purified or improved. Passion itself is not evil. What matters is its direction. Think of fire. Fire can burn down a house. But the same fire can cook food, provide warmth, and produce electricity. The problem is not the fire. The problem is how we use it. Similarly, desire can either control us, or it can become the driving force behind philosophy, art, science, and moral excellence. Comparing the two types of inspiration. Now let us compare both sides. In the irrational channel from Ion, emotion controls reason. People become passive. They simply receive inspiration without understanding it. In the erotic ascent from Symposium, reason gradually guides emotion. Love becomes the motivation for learning, self-improvement, and the search for eternal truth. One moves downward into emotional confusion. The other moves upward toward wisdom. This slide shows that Plato does not reject inspiration altogether. He rejects inspiration that ignores reason and merely excites emotion. However, he celebrates a higher kind of inspiration, where love becomes the force that leads the soul toward beauty, truth, wisdom, and ultimately, the eternal forms. This distinction is extremely important because it reveals that Plato is not against passion itself. He believes passion becomes valuable only when it is guided by reason and directed toward the highest reality.